Jasmine Crockett walked into the House Judiciary Committee room with her head high and her voice sharp. She was ready for a fight. Known across Texas and on national news for her aggressive style, Crockett had never backed down from a political battle. Today, her target was Attorney General Pam Bondi. Crockett had prepared for weeks. Her team had gathered documents, news clips, and social media posts. They believed Bondi was using her power to protect people close to Donald Trump, especially billionaire Elon Musk. Crockett was sure this was the moment to strike. The hearing room was packed with journalists, lawmakers, and cameras waiting for a headline. As Crockett's name was called, she rose with confidence and walked to the microphone. Her eyes were fixed on Bondi. "Miss Bondi," she began, her voice loud and direct. "The Justice Department under your watch has ignored real justice. You've protected billionaires like Elon Musk while the crimes of the Capitol riot remain hidden. I'm telling you now, if you don't resign, I will sue you personally." The words hit the room like a stone dropped in still water. Reporters raised their phones to record the moment. Staffers whispered to each other. Bondi, sitting calmly, showed no emotion. "You should be very careful with your words," Bondi replied, her voice cold and steady. "Accusing someone of this without proof is not only dangerous, it can be slander." But Crockett didn't blink. She stared hard at Bondi, holding her ground. The tension in the room was sharp. Everyone could feel it. Later that evening, clips of the confrontation spread fast. The video trended on Twitter. Talk show hosts called Crockett brave. News panels debated whether Bondi was hiding something. Crockett supporters praised her for standing up against the powerful. In her office that night, Crockett and her team smiled as they prepared the official legal threat. They drafted a letter demanding Bondi's resignation and a public apology. Crockett believed this letter would make her a national star. She thought she had forced Bondi into a corner. She imagined Bondi would either step down or become a public villain. But what Crockett didn't know was that Bondi wasn't afraid. She had faced bigger storms before. And behind Bondi was Elizabeth Harper, one of the most skilled attorneys in Washington. While Crockett was enjoying the media attention, Bondi's legal team worked in silence. Harper and her investigators began pulling document-sold emails, hidden financial records, and committee transcripts. They've found mistakes. They found that some of Crockett's bold claims in the past had been carefully shaped for the media, not always supported by full facts. They found her campaign's quiet connections to activist groups that had already faced legal trouble. Bondi didn't rush to reply. She let the pressure build. She let Crockett speak loudly on TV, repeating the threat and calling for justice. For days, the story stayed hot. Crockett's followers called her a hero. Her critics warned her she was moving too fast. Crockett's team didn't care. They believed Bondi was weak, that she would fold under public pressure. But then something strange happened. Bondi's office remained quiet. No press conferences, no interviews, no fear. Elizabeth Harper was preparing something very carefully. Behind closed doors, Bondi and Harper reviewed everything. They looked at Crockett's interviews, her social media posts, and even her campaign donors. They found a trail that no one expected to become public. One of Crockett's closest advisors had once worked with a group connected to foreign political. Funding, it was a weak connection, but it was there. Arte and Harper knew how to use it. The legal reply Harper was building wasn't just a defense, it was an attack. Meanwhile, Crockett supporters continued celebrating. They believed Bondi's silence was proof of guilt. They told Crockett she had already won. But as the days passed, Crockett started to wonder why Bondi wasn't responding. In private, her lawyers asked, what if Bondi's preparing something bigger? Crockett dismissed their worry. Please, she's trapped. She can't win this. But deep down, a small doubt started growing in her mind. Bondi wasn't panicking. She wasn't fighting on TV. She was waiting. And Crockett had no idea what was about to hit her. ChatGPT said. The reply from Bondi's office arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. It wasn't short, it wasn't defensive. It was a sharp, detailed 50-page legal document that hit Crockett's team like a sudden storm. Elizabeth Harper's letter was not just a response, it was a carefully designed strike. Inside, Harper laid out evidence that no one in Crockett's office expected to become public. The letter started by addressing Crockett's claims directly, but as Crockett's chief of staff read further, the tone shifted. Harper presented private emails, internal strategy notes, and financial records that painted a dangerous picture. Some of Crockett's most powerful public statements were linked to information she knew was incomplete. Some documents showed that Crockett's team had shaped stories to gain media attention, ignoring facts that would have weakened their position. Even worse, the letter exposed funding links that Crockett had never fully explained. Harper revealed that one of the activist groups supporting Crockett's campaign had quietly accepted foreign donations that were illegal under congressional ethics rules. The amounts weren't large, but they were enough to trigger a formal investigation. By the end of the letter, Harper made it clear, if Crockett continued her legal threat, Bondi's team was ready to escalate the case in court and in front of the House Ethics Committee. The media got hold of the letter within hours. The story flipped instantly. Reporters who had once praised Crockett now asked difficult questions about her funding. News anchors began replaying her past interviews, looking for signs of overstatements or manipulation. Some legal experts warned that if Harper's claims were true, Crockett could face ethics violations. Crockett's team went silent. They stopped. Their social media posts, interviews were canceled. Crockett, who had been so loud just days before, refused to appear on live shows. Inside her office, the atmosphere turned cold. Staffers who had once pushed her to fight now looked worried. Her lawyers started reviewing the connections Harper had exposed. One lawyer told her quietly, "They're not bluffing. They have the documents. And they've only shown us part of what they know." Crockett's supporters still hoped she would fight. They called for her to keep the pressure on Bondi. They didn't understand that the legal risk was now much greater than the public fight. Late at night, Crockett met privately with her closest advisors. "I can't back down," she whispered, her voice low but uncertain. "You might have to," one advisor said carefully. "Harper's team is prepared. If we push this to court, they'll open everything." Crockett shook her head. "If I back down now, I lose everything." But her team knew the damage was already spreading. A quiet call from the House Ethics Committee confirmed that they were reviewing the foreign funding connections. They hadn't made it public yet, but they were watching closely. Crockett reached out to Bondi's office in secret, offering to withdraw the lawsuit if the letter could be quietly buried. She proposed settling the matter away from the cameras. But Bondi's office never responded. Elizabeth Harper sent one. "Final message, we will defend this in full view of the public." Crockett felt the weight of that sentence. Her legal threat, which had once looked like a powerful political move, had collapsed. She tried to control the story by releasing a carefully written public statement, but the damage was already done. Journalists continued to dig. Talk show hosts, once friendly to her, now invited legal analysts who explained how Crockett's case had unraveled. In private, Crockett started sending personal messages to Bondi's office, messages of regret, asking if they could find a way to resolve the issue quietly. But those messages were ignored. Bondi's team, once the target, now controlled the pace of the story. For Crockett, the silence from Bondi's side was worse than a public fight. It left her isolated, with no one to argue against, no one to attack. Her advisors urged her to issue a direct apology. "She won't forgive you," one said, "but the public might." Crockett resisted at first. She wanted to find another path, a way to save her political future without bowing to her opponent. But each day, more details emerged. Journalists uncovered inconsistencies in her past statements. Financial records were shared by Harper's team with investigators. The pressure built. Finally, Crockett sat alone and began writing a personal apology letter to Bondi. Her hand trembled as she wrote. She wasn't just apologizing for the failed lawsuit. She was apologizing because, in her heart, she knew she had lost this fight completely. ChatGPT said, Jasmine Crockett sat at her desk long after midnight, her apology letter open in front of her. She had written it slowly, carefully choosing her words. But no matter how she framed it, the letter still sounded like surrender. She never imagined she would have to beg her political opponent for leniency. She sent the letter to Pam Bondi's office in silence, hoping it would remain private. But it didn't. By morning, the letter was leaked. It appeared on every major news outlet. Headlines flashed, Crockett's apology, from threat to surrender. News anchors read parts of her letter live on air. Her words were painful to hear. I regret my actions. I miscalculated. I ask Attorney General Bondi for understanding. It was a complete collapse. The woman who had once dominated the hearing, who had stood boldly in front of cameras threatening legal action, was now publicly pleading for mercy. Crockett's political allies went silent. No one defended her. Some quietly deleted their supportive tweets. Her own party members began to distance themselves, saying they would allow the ethics process to continue without interference. At her next scheduled press conference, Crockett appeared visibly shaken. Her voice, usually strong and sharp, was thin and slow. She admitted that her legal threat had gone too far. She said she would not pursue further action against Bondi. She tried to explain that her only goal was justice, but the reporters didn't let her off easily. Congresswoman, did you lie about the strength of your case? One asked. Did you coordinate with foreign-backed activist groups? Another pressed. She avoided some answers. She repeated safe lines, but the damage was done. Across social media, her supporters split. Some defended her, saying she was unfairly targeted by Bondi's powerful legal team. Others turned against her, accusing her of chasing headlines and betraying the causes she claimed to stand for. Inside Crockett's own office, the atmosphere turned tense. Staffers who once followed her without question now whispered behind closed doors. Some began searching for other jobs, sensing that her political career might be in serious trouble. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi didn't make any public appearances. She let the story unfold without adding pressure. But Elizabeth Harper, her attorney, made a brief statement to the press. We never intended to destroy reputations. We intended to defend the truth. Congresswoman Crockett's public apology speaks for itself. It was a controlled, powerful message. Bondi didn't need to speak. She had already won. Behind the scenes, the House Ethics Committee quietly accelerated their review. They requested documents, campaign finance records, and emails from Crockett's staff. One of Crockett's former advisors agreed to cooperate with the ethics investigators in exchange for legal protection. He provided messages and internal planning documents showing that Crockett's original threat against Bondi had been carefully staged to generate media support and political fundraising. Some of those messages connected Crockett's campaign to the activist group now under legal scrutiny for accepting foreign donations. The ethics investigation grew deeper. At the same time, international news agencies reported that some of the foreign funding had originally passed through European shell companies tied to a powerful lobbying network. The network had been quietly influencing political movements in several countries. It became clear that Crockett's story was no longer just about a failed lawsuit. It was now part of a wider international web of influence and secret funding. Crockett tried to slow the story, hoping that public interest would fade. But new leaks continued to surface. Journalists uncovered that Crockett's team had held private meetings with media consultants weeks before the hearing. The leaked documents showed those consultants had advised Crockett to make a public legal threat, even if her case wasn't strong, because it would create viral news. The strategy worked, but it had backfired. Crockett was now a headline for all the wrong reasons. Her public support dropped. Major donors pulled back from her campaign. Even some of her closest allies stopped returning her calls. In Washington, quiet whispers filled the halls. People said Crockett had made a deadly mistake. She underestimated her opponent and overestimated the protection of public sympathy. Pam Bondi continued her work, untouched by the storm. Her decision to stay silent gave her strength. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. Crockett understood now that the battle was lost. The only thing left was to protect what little remained of her career. But even that was slipping away. ChatGPT said Jasmine Crockett sat in her office staring at the walls, the silence pressing on her like a weight. The bright lights of the media that once chased her were gone. The phones, which used to ring with interview requests and political offers, were now mostly silent. Her staff worked quietly, some packing their desks, some avoiding her gaze. Apology letters she had sent to Pam Bondi had spread across every news channel. It wasn't just a political story anymore. It had become a symbol of a larger mistake, a story about power, ambition, and miscalculation. The House Ethics Committee moved forward quickly. They sent official notices requesting more records from Crockett's office. Her lawyers told her the investigation was no longer in the background. It was now the center of her career. Worse, the international side of the story had started growing beyond her control. Journalists from London, Berlin, and New Delhi reported that the activist group tied to her campaign had received funds from organizations connected to international lobbying networks. Those networks were already under investigation in other countries for interfering with elections and using their money to quietly push influence. Elizabeth Harper, Bondi's sharp and steady attorney, didn't speak to the press again. She didn't need to. The documents in Harper's letter had triggered a chain reaction that was still unfolding. For the first time in her political life, Crockett found herself completely on the defensive. Her advisors met with her behind closed doors. They told her that legal exposure was increasing. They had reviewed financial records, campaign connections, and old emails. There were things they couldn't explain to investigators. They couldn't easily untangle the money that had passed through questionable sources. One advisor, finally, said what no one wanted to say: "You need to think about whether staying in office is still possible." Crockett refused to consider it. Leaving would mean permanent defeat. She had fought for years to get here. She had challenged powerful people and had gained a national name. She couldn't let this be her ending, but reality was closing in. The Ethics Committee quietly shared information with the Department of Justice. Foreign intelligence agencies continued to watch the money trail. International banking regulators confirmed that at least some of the funds tied to Crockett's activist supporters had come from sources flagged in Europe's election influence investigations. Crockett's political enemies began circling. They started bringing up old conflicts. They raised questions about other votes she had taken, other groups she had supported. The damage spread. The White House, once quietly supportive of her strong public stance, distanced itself completely. When asked, the press secretary simply said, "The Congresswoman's situation is a legal matter. We have no further comment." Even Crockett's hometown supporters in Texas began to waver. Community leaders who had once proudly stood by her started appearing less frequently in public events. She realized that the system she had once used to build her influence, the same system that thrived on media, pressure, and fast-moving headlines, had turned against her. Her lawyers urged her to cooperate fully with the investigations. They believed that showing complete transparency was the only chance to limit long-term damage. But Crockett struggled to trust anyone now. The people she thought were her allies had stepped away. One night, her chief of staff came to her office and placed a folder on her desk. Inside was a complete timeline of the case. It showed every step, from her decision to challenge Bondi in the hearing, to the planned media rollout, to the connections now under investigation. At the bottom was a simple note: "This is the story they will tell about you unless you change." Crockett felt the weight of it. Her story was no longer the bold fighter for justice. Her story had become one of overconfidence, manipulation, and collapse. She thought of Pam Bondi, how Bondi had sat calmly during the hearing, how she had warned Crockett to be careful with her words. Crockett had ignored that warning. She had believed that public support, loud headlines, and political pressure would be enough. Oh, she had been wrong. Now, as the Ethics Committee moved closer to formal charges and international investigators traced the money, Crockett had to decide whether to fight a battle she had already lost or step back before the system completely consumed her. The silence in her office felt deeper that night. The system she once believed she could bend had proven stronger, colder, and more patient than she ever expected. Jasmine Crockett knew the walls were closing in, but she still clung to the idea that she could control the damage. Her team was shrinking, her public appearances carefully staged, and her statements now passed through multiple lawyers before they were released. Yet, despite the layers of protection, she could feel her grip on the situation slipping. The House Ethics Committee called for her to testify behind closed doors. It wasn't a request, it was a formal summons. Her lawyers warned her the session could lead to more public exposure if the details leaked. But Crockett had no choice. Refusing to appear would only make things worse. The night before her testimony, she sat alone in her apartment, watching old interviews where she had once spoken with such power and certainty. She barely recognized the woman on the screen. Back then, she had believed she was unstoppable, that the media and public would always stand with her if she appeared bold and righteous. But the landscape had shifted, and now she stood alone. The next morning, she walked into the Ethics Committee room, where a handful of members waited, along with their legal teams and government investigators. The air was heavy. The tone was professional but cold. They didn't need to shout. The facts were enough to break her now. The questioning was sharp. They pressed her on the funding trails, on her knowledge of foreign donations, on the internal messages that showed she had intended to use the lawsuit against Bondi to boost her own profile. She tried to defend herself. She claimed she had trusted her staff, that she wasn't aware of some details. But the investigators pushed back. They showed her messages with her direct approval. They presented timelines that clearly connected her public moves to private media strategies. They even had recorded phone logs between her team and outside consultants who had advised them to create the fight. Even if the legal threat was weak, Crockett could feel herself losing ground with every answer. When the questioning ended, they informed her that the committee would consider whether to bring formal charges. They said nothing else. No advice, no sympathy. She left the room knowing that whatever power she once held there was gone. Back at her office, her advisors were waiting. One of them had spoken to friendly journalists to see if any could still protect her side of the story. The response was cold. No one wanted to take the risk now. Even the anchors who once praised her were now running stories about her fall, showing side-by-side clips of her threats, the apology, and the investigation timeline. The public narrative was locked in. She was the aggressor whose plan had crumbled. In desperation, Crockett reached out to Elizabeth Harper, Pam Bondi's attorney. She asked for a private call not as a politician, but as a person. She wanted to know if there was any way to end the battle quietly without further exposure. She thought maybe she could offer a full public retreat, step away from future legal action, even issue another apology. But Harper refused the call instead. Bondi's office released a simple statement. We believe in defending truth, not cutting. Backroom deals. Crockett's last option was gone. That same day, new reports surfaced from European investigators. They confirmed that the activist group tied to Crockett's campaign had accepted funds from sources flagged for influencing foreign political movements. The investigators said they would soon share their findings. With U.S. authorities, the international story was now fully alive. It was no longer just about Crockett's failed threat. It was about cross-border money, secret influence networks. And whether us lawmakers had unknowingly or knowingly benefited from foreign pressure, Crockett's own party leaders started to push her toward resignation behind the scenes. They told her that even if she survived the ethics committee, her career would be permanently damaged. She was a liability now, a story they couldn't control. She resisted. She didn't want to be remembered this way, but the pressure didn't stop. Late that night, sitting alone again, she read through the entire timeline of her downfall, from the first hearing till the leaked apology to the collapsed legal threat. She finally understood what had gone wrong. She had believed she could control the narrative. She thought fast moves and loud headlines could protect her, but Bondi had used silence and precision. Elizabeth Harper had played a long, patient game, and Crockett had walked straight into the trap. The story she had tried to write about power, and justice was no longer hers. The system had taken it away. Her fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time. Crockett realized she had already lost more than she ever expected. ChatGPT said in the following days. Jasmine Crockett's world grew even smaller. Each morning brought new headlines, not of her making, but about her downfall. Reporters who once called her fearless now dissected every step of her miscalculation. Former allies appeared on television panels to distance themselves. They spoke carefully, choosing words that protected their own futures. But the message was clear. Crockett had become politically untouchable. The House Ethics Committee formally announced that it was launching a full investigation into Crockett's financial ties and potential ethics violations. The words were dry, almost technical, but their weight was undeniable. The story now belonged to official investigators. Crockett no longer controlled the timing or the details. The machine was moving with or without her. Her lawyers gathered in her office late into the evening, papers spread across the conference table. They told her bluntly, there is no easy way out now. If you stay and fight, you risk public hearings, criminal referrals, and a complete collapse. If you step down, you might save a small piece of your future. Crockett's first instinct was to resist. Resignation would mean surrender. It would mean admitting that the entire sequence of threat, the lawsuit, the collapse, had been a disaster of her own making. But as she listened to her team, her silence grew longer. Across the country, news stations ran special reports on the growing influence of foreign money in American politics. Her name was always mentioned, even though no direct criminal charge had been filed yet. Her reputation was already lost. And worse, Elizabeth Harper wasn't finished. A quiet source inside the Ethics Committee warned Crockett's team that Bondi's attorney had submitted additional evidence tying Crockett's foreign-backed activist group to a second lawmaker's campaign. The investigation was expanding. Bondi's legal strategy was precise. She wasn't just defending herself. She was systematically exposing every connection, every hidden line of influence, with Crockett at the center. Crockett's advisors now pleaded with her to step down before the full storm arrived. The party leadership made it clear that if she didn't resign, they would publicly withdraw their support. For the first time, Crockett began to understand that no one would stand with her in the final hour. She stayed awake all night, writing drafts of a resignation letter and then tearing them apart. She thought of the fight she had started in that hearing room. She thought of the cameras, the loud promises, the media headlines. She had believed she could shake the system. But she had underestimated the system's patience and Bondi's silence. The next morning, Crockett's resignation appeared on her social media accounts. The letter was formal, brief, and careful. She said she was stepping down to protect the integrity of the office and allow the investigations to proceed without distraction. She did not admit guilt, but the words felt hollow. Everyone knew why she was leaving. The news hit quickly. Some supporters expressed sadness, others frustration. But the political world moved on faster than she expected. Within hours, attention shifted to who might replace her. The story was still alive, but she was no longer at the center of it. In a quiet press statement, Pam Bondi said only this: "We never sought to destroy anyone. We sought only to protect the truth." It was the final controlled message. Elizabeth Harper refused all interview requests. She had one without ever needing to appear on camera. Crockett's fall became a case study in political strategy classes. Analysts discussed how a public fight, poorly calculated, could collapse in the face of a quiet, legal counterattack. Foreign influence investigations continued, now stretching beyond Crockett's story. But her chapter had closed. In her final days in office, she walked the halls of Congress alone. The noise and the cameras gone. The people who once celebrated her victories now barely made eye contact. She understood now that her mistake hadn't been in challenging power. Her mistake had been believing that loud threats were enough to defeat careful, patient opponents who knew how to let silence do. The work her fight had started with fire and ended in a quiet surrender. And no one, not even she, would be able to rewrite that ending. Jasmine Crockett's resignation did not silence the storm. Even after she stepped down, the investigations continued to unfold like a slow-moving earthquake, cracking the ground beneath others who had once stood with her. The activist group that had supported her was now under federal review, its financial ties to shadowy international sources drawing the attention of intelligence agencies across Europe and the United States. The House Ethics Committee quietly released a summary report weeks later. It detailed how Crockett's public threat against Attorney General Pam Bondi was carefully staged, coordinated with media consultants and political strategists who saw the confrontation as a chance to elevate Crockett's national profile. The report confirmed that foreign-backed activist funds, though not directly controlled by Crockett, had helped build the machinery that supported her campaign's aggressive legal posture. The report didn't recommend criminal charges, but it was enough to finish her political career. Her reputation, once fierce and uncompromising, was now permanently tied to recklessness, miscalculation, and failed ambition. Pam Bondi remained in her position, untouched by the scandal. She never gave a single interview about the incident. Her silence became her power. The media, desperate for her reaction, eventually moved on when none came. Elizabeth Harper, Bondi's attorney, was quietly celebrated among Washington's legal insiders. She had dismantled Crockett's threat piece by piece, using documents, precision, and patience. She never raised her voice. She never appeared on television, and yet she had won completely. Months after the resignation, Crockett returned to Texas, far from the cameras, far from the Capitol where she had once believed she could change the system. She tried to rebuild a life outside the public eye. Offers to return to television or write a political memoir came, but she turned them down. This story was no longer hers to tell. Sometimes she would watch congressional hearings on TV from her apartment, quietly remembering the sharpness of the lights, the energy of confrontation. She realized that the system she had tried to challenge was built to absorb noise. It could withstand pressure. It could wait. And when it responded, it did so with quiet precision. The media, always chasing the next story, slowly moved on to other conflicts, other rising stars, other scandals. Crockett's moment in history became a brief, sharp lesson. In politics, power is not always loud, and silence can cut deeper than words. One afternoon, she received a simple envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside, there was only a handwritten note. Truth doesn't need to shout. Survives. No signature. But Crockett knew exactly who had sent it. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer, closing it softly. There was nothing left to fight. No more speeches. No more threats. Just the quiet knowledge that she had been outmatched by someone who understood the system better than she ever had. Jasmine Crockett's fall wasn't just a political defeat, was a reminder of how power really works. Doesn't always stand on a stage. It waits, it listens, and when the time is right, it moves with devastating precision. And when the story finally fades, power remains calm, silent, and undefeated.